Michael Lewis was looking for someone to care for his daughter, Ellie, but what happened next will leave you speechless. Watch till the end to uncover this shocking story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft, pale light over the sprawling estate that Michael Lewis called home. Inside, the air was heavy with a lingering sadness, a reminder of the woman whose laughter once filled every corner of the house. It had been 6 months since he lost his wife, Caroline, to a relentless illness that robbed her of life far too soon. The void she left behind was impossible to ignore, especially for their 6-year-old daughter, Ellie. Michael sat at the kitchen table, staring into his untouched cup of coffee. His tailored suit and polished shoes hinted at his successful business career, but his tired eyes told another story. He had spent countless sleepless nights worrying about Ellie. She had always been a bright, energetic child, but since Caroline's passing, she had withdrawn into a shell. Her once vibrant laughter had been replaced by quiet whispers and long, somber silences. Across the table, Ellie sat with her head bowed, pushing cereal around in her bowl with a spoon. Her small frame seemed even smaller in her oversized pajamas, and her curly hair fell messily over her face. She looked up at her father with a timid smile, and Michael's heart broke a little more. He knew he needed help, not just for himself, but for Ellie. The decision to hire a nanny had not come easily. Michael prided himself on being able to manage both his personal and professional responsibilities, but the weight of grief and single parenthood had become too much to bear. After weeks of interviews, he finally settled on someone who seemed perfect, Martha, a middle-aged woman with a warm demeanor and glowing references. She had spoken passionately about her love for children, and Michael had felt a glimmer of hope that she could bring some stability back into their lives. When Martha arrived that morning, Ellie hid behind Michael's leg, clutching his hand tightly. The nanny greeted her with a kind smile and crouched down to Ellie's level. "Hello, sweetheart," Martha said softly. "I know things have been hard for you lately, but I'm here to help, okay?" Ellie didn't respond, but Michael noticed her grip on his hand loosened slightly. He took that as a good sign. Martha wasted no time settling into her new role. Over the next few weeks, she took over many of the household duties that had fallen by the wayside since Caroline's death. She organized Ellie's room, prepared meals, and even helped with bedtime routines. Michael began to relax for the first time in months, grateful for the semblance of normalcy Martha brought to their lives. At first, Ellie seemed to warm up to Martha. She allowed the nanny to braid her hair and read her bedtime stories, though she rarely spoke more than a few words. Michael noticed small changes in his daughter. She started eating a little more and occasionally played with her toys again. But as the weeks went on, something began to feel off. It wasn't anything Michael could put his finger on, but the atmosphere in the house seemed different. The staff, who had worked for the Lewis family for years, appeared unusually quiet and withdrawn. Ellie's initial progress seemed to stall. She became even more hesitant to speak, and often looked over her shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. One evening, as Michael returned home late from work, he found the house eerily silent. He stepped into the living room and saw Ellie sitting alone on the couch, staring blankly at the television. Her favorite cartoon was playing, but she didn't seem to be paying attention. "Ellie, sweetheart, are you okay?" he asked, kneeling in front of her. She nodded but didn't meet his eyes. Michael gently lifted her chin, and for a brief moment he thought he saw fear flicker across her face. Before he could press further, Martha appeared in the doorway. "Oh, Mr. Lewis, you're home," she exclaimed, her tone cheerful but with an edge of surprise. "Ellie's been a little tired today. I think she just needs some rest." Michael nodded, though his concern lingered. He decided not to push Ellie that night, but the feeling that something was wrong gnawed at him. Over the following days, Michael tried to spend more time with Ellie, but she seemed increasingly distant. Her once bright eyes now held a shadow of sadness that he couldn't ignore. One morning, as he prepared to leave for a business meeting, he noticed her flinch when Martha entered the room. It was subtle, but it was enough to set off alarms in his mind. That evening, Michael sat in his study, staring at a photo of Caroline. Her radiant smile and kind eyes seemed to reach out to him from the frame. He felt a pang of guilt for not being able to protect Ellie better. "Caroline," he whispered, his voice heavy with emotion. "I don't know what's happening, but I promise I'll figure it out. I won't let anything hurt our little girl." With that vow, Michael resolved to pay closer attention to everything happening in his home. He didn't know it yet, but the darkness lurking within his walls was about to reveal itself in ways he could never have imagined. The next few weeks in the Lewis household were marked by an unsettling shift in atmosphere. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Martha kept the house running smoothly, preparing meals, organizing schedules, and maintaining a meticulous order that even impressed Michael. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks began to form, cracks that only Ellie and the house staff seemed to notice. Ellie, once timid but slowly recovering from her grief, became eerily quiet. She avoided eye contact, walked with her head down, and flinched at sudden noises. Michael dismissed these changes as a natural part of her coping process, unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. Martha's demeanor had subtly transformed. The warm, nurturing persona she displayed during her interview began to fade, replaced by a sternness that bordered on cold authority. She no longer asked for cooperation. She demanded it. The house staff, long loyal to the Lewis family, found themselves walking on eggshells around her. Whispers circulated among them about her temper and her sharp tongue, but none dared to confront her. It started with small things. Martha began issuing strict instructions to the housekeepers, often criticizing their work and claiming that Michael expected higher standards. She made veiled threats about their employment, implying that she had the power to sway Michael's decisions. "You wouldn't want Mr. Lewis to think you're incompetent, would you?" she said to one of the maids, her smile ice cold. The staff's unease grew when Martha began to focus her attention on Ellie. Initially, it seemed innocent, gentle reminders to clean up after herself or behave at the dinner table. But those reminders soon turned into scolding, and the scolding escalated into outright cruelty. "Stop slouching," Martha snapped one afternoon as Ellie sat on the floor coloring. "Do you want your father to think you're lazy? Pick up those crayons now." Ellie obeyed without a word, her small hands trembling as she gathered the scattered crayons. When Michael entered the room moments later, Martha's demeanor instantly softened. She greeted him with her usual warm smile, masking the sharpness that had just filled her voice. As the days passed, Martha's control over Ellie deepened. She began assigning the child small chores under the guise of teaching her responsibility. Ellie was made to clean her room, fold her laundry, and even help clear the dinner table, tasks that, while not unreasonable, were accompanied by threats and intimidation. "If you don't do it right, I'll tell your father you've been misbehaving," Martha warned one evening as Ellie hesitated while folding a towel. "But Ellie started, her voice barely above a whisper. "No buts," Martha cut her off. "You wouldn't want him to be disappointed in you, would you?" Ellie shook her head quickly, tears welling in her eyes. She completed the task without another word, her small hands fumbling in fear. Martha's manipulations didn't end with chores. She began isolating Ellie from the house staff, ensuring that no one else had the opportunity to intervene or question her authority. On more than one occasion, staff members overheard Martha raising her voice at Ellie behind closed doors, but when confronted, Martha dismissed their concerns. "She's just being stubborn," Martha explained with a sigh. "Children need discipline, and Mr. Lewis has trusted me to ensure she grows up well-mannered." Meanwhile, Michael remained oblivious to the true nature of Martha's actions. Her charm and efficiency blinded him to the growing tension within his own home. She continued to present herself as the perfect caregiver, often sharing anecdotes about Ellie's day to reassure him. "Ellie is making progress," Martha told him one evening as they sat in the living room. "She's still adjusting, but I'm confident she'll come around soon." Michael nodded, grateful for Martha's dedication. He wanted to believe that things were improving, but a nagging doubt lingered in the back of his mind. Ellie, however, was far from improving. Martha's tyranny took a toll on her spirit, and the once lively girl became a shadow of herself. She rarely spoke, avoided playing with her toys, and spent most of her time quietly drawn in the corner of her room. The drawings, once filled with bright colors and happy scenes, now depicted dark shapes and chaotic scribbles. One evening, Ellie summoned the courage to speak to one of the housekeepers, a kind woman named Clara, who had worked for the Lewis family for years. Clara found Ellie sitting alone in the kitchen, staring blankly at her untouched plate of food. "Ellie, sweetheart, are you okay?" Clara asked, kneeling beside her. Ellie hesitated, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if afraid someone might overhear. Finally, she whispered, "Martha scares me." Clara's heart sank. She had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed filled her with dread. Before she could respond, Martha entered the kitchen, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "Clara, don't you have work to do?" Martha said sharply. Clara stood quickly, her hands trembling. "Of course, Miss Martha. I was just checking on Ellie." "I'll handle her," Martha replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. Clara left the kitchen, casting one last worried glance at Ellie. She wanted to say something to Michael, but the fear of losing her job silenced her. Martha's influence over the household was complete. Ellie, now entirely under Martha's control, lived in constant fear. Every day brought new demands, punishments, and threats. Martha made sure Ellie knew that any attempt to tell her father the truth would result in severe consequences. "If you ever tell him," Martha hissed one night, leaning close to Ellie's ear, "I'll make sure he never looks at you the same way again." The little girl nodded, her eyes wide with terror. She believed every word Martha said, and her silence became a prison from which she saw no escape. Meanwhile, Michael remained unaware of the turmoil unfolding within his home. His faith in Martha blinded him to the signs that something was terribly wrong. But the growing distance between him and Ellie gnawed at his heart, planting seeds of doubt that would soon force him to confront the truth. Michael noticed the changes in Ellie but struggled to make sense of them. His once lively daughter had become withdrawn and subdued, a shadow of her former self. She rarely smiled and avoided his gaze. When he asked her about her day, her answers were clipped and devoid of the enthusiasm she once had. "School was fine," she'd say, barely lifting her head from her plate during dinner. Michael tried to engage her, offering to play her favorite board game or watch cartoons together, but she always declined, retreating to her room after meals. The bright energy that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a quiet melancholy that made Michael's heart ache. Martha continued to reassure him, insisting that Ellie's behavior was a natural part of grieving. "She just needs time," Martha said, with a sympathetic smile one evening as they sat in the living room. "Children process loss differently, and Ellie has been through so much. I've been doing everything I can to help her feel secure." Michael nodded, wanting to believe her. After all, Martha had been a reliable presence in their lives since she arrived. She managed the household with efficiency and care, allowing him to focus on his demanding work. Still, a gnawing doubt lingered in his mind. The household staff, meanwhile, noticed Ellie's growing distress but felt powerless to act. Martha had tightened her grip on the home, ensuring that no one interfered with her authority. She often reminded them of their place, using Michael's trust in her as leverage. "Mr. Lewis relies on me to keep things in order," she said to Clara, the head housekeeper, one afternoon. "If you can't meet his expectations, I'll have no choice but to recommend a replacement." Clara bit her tongue, unwilling to risk her job, but increasingly troubled by what she saw. She often caught glimpses of Ellie's frightened expression or overheard Martha's harsh words, but any attempt to intervene was swiftly shut down. Ellie's fear of Martha grew daily. The nanny had found new ways to exert control over the little girl, assigning her tasks that went far beyond what was appropriate for a 6-year-old. "Clean up the kitchen," Martha ordered one afternoon, pointing to the mess left from baking cookies. "And make sure it's spotless. I don't want to hear a single complaint." Ellie hesitated, her small hands clutching the hem of her shirt. "But I don't know how to—" "Figure it out," Martha snapped, her voice low and threatening, "unless you want me to tell your father how ungrateful you've been." Ellie's face turned pale, and she quickly got to work, struggling to scrub the countertops and rinse the dishes. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she dared not cry. Martha watched her like a hawk, her stern gaze making it clear that failure was not an option. By the time Michael returned home that evening, Ellie was already in her room, curled up on her bed with a stuffed animal clutched tightly to her chest. Martha greeted him at the door, her usual warm smile in place. "Ellie had a quiet day," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think she's starting to adjust." Michael nodded, grateful for what seemed like progress, but his gut told him otherwise. Later that night, as he passed Ellie's room, he noticed her light still on. Knocking gently, he opened the door to find her staring at a drawing on her desk. "Sweetheart, it's late. You should be asleep," he said softly, stepping into the room. Ellie quickly flipped the paper over, hiding it from view. I wasn't tired," she mumbled. Michael frowned but didn't press her. Instead, he sat on the edge of her bed and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Ellie, you know you can talk to me about anything, right? If something's bothering you, I want to help." She nodded but didn't say a word. Her silence spoke volumes, and Michael's concern deepened. He kissed her forehead and tucked her in, vowing to get to the bottom of whatever was troubling her. The next morning, as Michael prepared to leave for work, he noticed Ellie flinch when Martha entered the kitchen. It was a subtle reaction, but it didn't escape his attention. He watched as Martha poured Ellie a glass of juice, her movements brisk and businesslike. Ellie murmured a quiet "thank you" and kept her eyes downcast. Martha turned to Michael with a bright smile. "Have a great day at work, Mr. Lewis. Don't worry about a thing here. We've got it all under control." Michael forced a smile in return, but the unease in his chest wouldn't go away. That evening, he brought up his concerns to Martha over dinner. "I've noticed Ellie's been more withdrawn lately," he said carefully. "She seems different." Martha tilted her head, feigning concern. "I've noticed it too, but I really think it's just her way of processing everything. Losing a parent is a big adjustment, and she's still so young." Michael nodded, but her words didn't fully convince him. Over the next few days, he paid closer attention to Ellie's behavior, hoping to uncover the root of her unhappiness. What he found only deepened his suspicions. One afternoon, while reviewing paperwork in his study, he overheard a faint noise coming from the hallway. Stepping out quietly, he saw Ellie on her hands and knees, scrubbing the floor with a cloth. Martha stood over her, arms crossed. "Do it properly, Ellie," Martha said sharply. "Your father wouldn't want to see a mess when he gets home." Michael froze, his mind racing. He wanted to intervene but hesitated, unsure of what he had just witnessed. By the time he stepped forward, Martha had already noticed him. "Mr. Lewis," she exclaimed, her tone cheerful. "Ellie wanted to help with the cleaning. She insisted, didn't you, Ellie?" Ellie nodded quickly, avoiding her father's gaze. Michael's chest tightened, but he forced a smile, not wanting to alarm his daughter. That night, as he lay in bed, Michael replayed the scene in his mind. Something wasn't adding up. Ellie's behavior, Martha's explanations, it all felt wrong. He resolved to dig deeper, determined to find out the truth. Whatever was happening in his home, he would not rest until he uncovered it. Michael's concern for Ellie reached a breaking point. Her withdrawn demeanor, the way she flinched when Martha was near, and the growing distance between them gnawed at him. His instincts told him something was deeply wrong, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He decided to take matters into his own hands. Early one morning, Michael called Martha into his study, feigning a sense of urgency. "I'll be heading into the office earlier than usual today," he told her. "It's a packed schedule, so I might not be back until late." Martha smiled, her expression as polished and practiced as always. "Of course, Mr. Lewis. I'll make sure everything here is taken care of." Michael nodded and left the room, making a show of gathering his briefcase and keys. As soon as he exited the house, he circled around to a side door and slipped back inside. He had no intention of going to work. Instead, he found a quiet corner in his home office where he could observe without being seen. He had positioned small security cameras around the house days earlier, their feeds streaming to his laptop. He hoped to confirm his suspicions. The morning passed slowly, the minutes dragging on as Michael monitored the cameras. For a while, everything seemed routine. Martha moved through the house, issuing instructions to the staff, while Ellie played quietly in her room. But then the mood shifted. Michael's breath caught as he watched Martha enter Ellie's room, her face set in a harsh expression. She slammed the door shut behind her, cutting off the view from the hallway camera. Panic surged through him, but he quickly switched to the camera inside Ellie's room, a precaution he had taken after noticing her increasing fear. On the screen, he saw Martha standing over Ellie, who sat frozen on the edge of her bed. Martha's voice was low but laced with venom. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Martha said, her tone threatening. "I saw the way you looked at your father last night. Do you think he's going to save you?" Ellie shook her head quickly, her small hands gripping the hem of her dress. "Good," Martha continued, "because if you tell him anything, I'll make sure he sends you away. Do you hear me? He doesn't need a pathetic, useless little girl making his life harder." Michael's chest tightened as rage coursed through him. He had suspected Martha was manipulating Ellie, but seeing her cruelty in action was almost too much to bear. He clenched his fists, struggling to keep his composure as the scene unfolded. Martha grabbed Ellie's arm roughly, pulling her to her feet. "Now, go clean up the kitchen, and if I see one speck of dirt, you'll regret it." Ellie nodded, tears streaming down her face, and hurried out of the room. Michael watched as she made her way to the kitchen, her small frame trembling with fear. He couldn't stay hidden any longer. Grabbing his phone, he recorded the footage from the laptop screen as additional proof before storming out of his office. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the hallway as he approached the kitchen. He found Ellie standing on a stool, struggling to reach the sink as she washed dishes with shaking hands. Martha stood nearby, arms crossed and face stern. "Ellie," Michael said, his voice steady but firm. She froze, the plate slipping from her hands and clattering into the sink. Martha turned, her face shifting from annoyance to surprise. "Mr. Lewis," she said, forcing a smile. "I thought you were at work." Michael stepped forward, his gaze locked on Martha. "I think it's time we talked." Martha opened her mouth to respond, but he raised a hand to silence her. "Ellie, sweetheart, go to your room." Ellie hesitated, glancing nervously between her father and Martha. "But—" "Go," Michael said gently. "It's okay." Once Ellie was out of sight, Michael turned back to Martha, his voice hardening. "I've seen enough. I know what you've been doing." Martha's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, adopting a defensive tone. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've done nothing but care for your daughter." Michael pulled his phone from his pocket, showing her the video he had just recorded. Her face paled as the footage played, her own words damning her. "You call this care?" Michael said, his voice rising. "You've been terrorizing my daughter, threatening her, forcing her to do your work, and God knows what else." Martha's composure cracked, and she took a step back. "You don't understand," she stammered. "She's been misbehaving. I was just trying to teach her discipline." "Discipline." Michael's voice was sharp, his anger barely contained. "You've been abusing her. You've been manipulating everyone in this house, including me." Martha's expression shifted, her mask of civility dropping. "You think you can just throw me out after everything I've done for you?" she spat. "I've been running this house while you wallow in grief. Without me, you'd be lost." Michael took a step closer, his tone cold and final. "Get out of my house, now." Martha's eyes darted around as if searching for an escape. "You can't do this," she hissed. "I'll make sure you regret it." Michael crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "The only one who will regret anything is you. Leave before I call the police." Martha glared at him, her face twisted with rage, but she knew she had no choice. She stormed out of the kitchen, her footsteps heavy as she made her way to the front door. Michael followed to ensure she left, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and fury. When the door slammed shut behind her, Michael let out a shaky breath. He turned and headed to Ellie's room, finding her curled up on her bed. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red and swollen. "It's okay now, sweetheart," he said softly, sitting beside her. "She's gone. She'll never hurt you again." Ellie burst into tears, throwing her arms around him. Michael held her tightly, vowing to protect her from anyone who tried to harm her. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Justice would be served, and their home would finally be a place of safety again. The days following Martha's departure were filled with a mixture of relief and unease. Michael knew he had done the right thing, but the damage she had inflicted on Ellie and their household couldn't be undone so easily. He spent hours reassuring his daughter, holding her close, and reminding her that she was safe now. Yet the fear in her eyes lingered, a painful reminder of the torment she had endured. Michael wasted no time gathering evidence to hold Martha accountable. The video footage from his home cameras was damning, capturing not only her harsh words, but also the physical and emotional abuse she had inflicted on Ellie. He worked closely with his legal team, determined to see justice served. "This footage is more than enough to press charges," Patterson said, his tone firm. "We'll move forward with a lawsuit for child abuse, emotional distress, and workplace harassment. The courts will take this seriously." Michael nodded, his jaw tight. "She didn't just hurt my daughter. She manipulated and terrorized everyone under this roof. I want her held accountable for every bit of it." Patterson assured him that they had a strong case, and within days, legal action was underway. Martha was served with a lawsuit, and the media caught wind of the story, adding the pressure to the situation. The once respected nanny was now facing public scrutiny, her name tarnished by her actions. Ellie, meanwhile, began to slowly open up about her experiences. At first, she was hesitant, her voice trembling as she recounted the threats and punishments Martha had imposed, but as she saw her father's unwavering support, she found the courage to share more. "She said you wouldn't love me if I told you," Ellie whispered one evening, curled up beside Michael on the couch. "She said you'd send me away." Michael's heart broke at her words. He hugged her tightly, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Ellie, I love you more than anything in this world. Nothing anyone says or does will ever change that. Do you understand?" Ellie nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that things could get better. The trial date came quickly, and Michael found himself sitting in a courtroom, Ellie by his side. She clung to his hand as they faced the judge and jury, her small frame dwarfed by the imposing surroundings. Michael had debated whether to bring her, but Ellie insisted on being there, determined to see justice served. Martha sat across the room, her once confident demeanor replaced by a look of fear and defiance. She tried to deny the accusations, claiming the footage had been taken out of context, but her arguments fell flat. The evidence was overwhelming, and witnesses from the household staff stepped forward to corroborate Ellie's story. Clara, the head housekeeper, spoke with conviction as she described Martha's manipulative tactics and the fear she instilled in everyone under her control. "We all saw what was happening," Clara said, her voice steady, "but we were too scared to speak up. We thought we'd lose our jobs." Ellie's testimony was perhaps the most powerful. Despite her young age, she spoke with a quiet strength that moved everyone in the courtroom. She said, "I was bad, and that my daddy wouldn't love me anymore," Ellie said, her voice wavering but determined. "But my daddy does love me." And she was wrong. Michael felt a surge of pride and sadness as he listened to his daughter's brave words. He squeezed her hand, silently vowing to make sure she never had to endure such pain again. The trial lasted several days, but the verdict was clear. The judge found Martha guilty of child abuse, emotional manipulation, and workplace harassment. She was sentenced to several years in prison, her pleas for leniency falling on deaf ears. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, Michael pulled Ellie into a hug. The weight of the past months lifted slightly, replaced by a sense of closure and hope. Justice had been served, and their family could finally begin to heal. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the Lewis household transformed. The staff, no longer living in fear, returned to their warm and supportive roles. Michael focused on rebuilding his relationship with Ellie, dedicating more time to her than ever before. They spent their days playing games, reading stories, and exploring the city together. Ellie's laughter slowly returned, each giggle a small victory that filled Michael with gratitude. He arranged therapy sessions for her, ensuring she had the tools to process her trauma and regain her confidence. One sunny afternoon, Michael and Ellie sat in the backyard, enjoying a picnic under the shade of a large oak tree. Ellie was drawing in her sketchbook, her crayons scattered around her. "Daddy," she said, looking up from her drawing, "do you think Mommy would be proud of us?" Michael smiled, his eyes softening. "I know she would be, sweetheart. She'd be so proud of how brave and strong you are." Ellie beamed, her face lighting up in a way Michael hadn't seen in months. He knew they still had a long road ahead, but for the first time in a while he felt hopeful. Their lives had been shaken, but together they were rebuilding something stronger. The bond between father and daughter was unbreakable, and Michael vowed to protect Ellie with everything he had. No one would ever hurt her again. Michael and Ellie's story shows us the importance of standing up for what's right and protecting those we love. What do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this one.